Welcome to Joe's Election Day coverage on the State of Us. We're joined here this morning by Una Mullally, journalist and columnist of the Irish Times, and Joe's Carl Kinsella. What we want to talk about first is the appetite there seems to be for something different. Like we talked about this during the campaign. Everyone picked up on this sense of a surge that was focused around Sinn Féin, and it does seem to have been borne out by the exit poll and the early tallies that we're getting. One of the most startling things I thought from the exit poll was that, you know, there was early polls that said 75% of people wanted change. When that's broken down in this poll, it is 31% wanted radical change. I wonder, Una, if you feel, or why you feel the two traditional parties didn't pick up on that sense.
I think there's a million reasons, but I think that broadly, you know, these kind of binaries that we're so embedded in Irish society are gone, you know, and it's a generational shift, it's a shift in attitude, it's a shift in political consciousness, it's a shift in loads of different things. And when you kind of, it's hard to reflect on a campaign, you know, the day of account, but Fine Gael really ran a very poor campaign. And Sinn Féin connected with voters, and Fianna Fáil just tried to like men in black people with their little stick. But, you know, is it about a campaign? Ultimately, you know, the dominant force in what we've been experiencing over the last month is a political and media establishment trying to reckon with public sentiment. And public sentiment has, you know, outweighed any kind of campaign trickery that could have taken place. And the fact is Sinn Féin and left-wing parties were tapped into that public sentiment.
And what specific, because we've seen the polls and what people voted on, what issues were concerning voters when they voted, but what would you say was the thing that has Sinn Féin tapped into most fundamentally?
Like, I think that when you look at the messaging and how the different parties are positioning themselves, whatever you think about Sinn Féin, I do think that they're probably the only party offering a broad vision for society. And now, whether you can say that that vision is fantastical or populist or, you know, very difficult to see through, like even when you look at the kind of voting Eve video that they dropped on social media, and it's all about like being on the threshold and this election will define the next 50 years or century or whatever. They're saying these things that are very ambitious, very bold, very forward looking. I'm not sure what Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's vision for society is. And I think that Sinn Féin are tapping into this public attitude that basically, you know, there's a rise in confidence, there's a rise in patriotism, and people aren't necessarily really enjoying how the recession era policies have now been cleaned up, and the type of Ireland that's being built doesn't really seem to chime with the electorate.
Carl, that's certainly, like, you know, we've seen around across all the demographics that Sinn Féin's popularity, it isn't just a youth quake or whatever people want to talk about, although among, you know, that cohort, they are like 10 points clear of any other party. So there is, like, that is driving it. But like in a city like Dublin, we've seen like they're so far ahead. Do you think it is the key issue, as Una said, of like the society that people see, a city that, you know, people see growing up or being rebuilt around them in a way they don't like?
Well, I think a lot of Sinn Féin's appeal has to do with the fact that they've always been an exciting party. Obviously, due to their history, there's something taboo about them, and the way their appeal is now spreading across different demographics kind of reminds me a little bit of just like weed, where it's like young people have always been like cool, you know, cool with weed or whatever, and now you're getting people like in their 40s and 50s being like, yeah, I might try a little Sinn Féin, you know, might be a bit bold this time around. And so like you've basically got a situation where the more they've been normalised, and I think they've been normalised by the attacks on them by Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, who people don't trust. So like when you've got a situation where they're painted as the opponent, you've got people thinking like, well, what's their vision? You know, like if I'm not happy with the current vision, these guys are the diametric opposite to the current vision, so I'm going to explore their vision. And Sinn Féin have always been a big picture party. They've always had lofty goals. They've always wanted things like a united Ireland. So I think people are, and like Una says, you know, maybe it is fantastical, maybe it is populist, but they're good at telling a story. They're good at selling their message. And it's a lot more appealing to people than cranes in the sky, a lot more appealing to people than low corporation tax. I think when it comes down to it, Sinn Féin are selling in Ireland, the people are it's obviously more romantic. It's the kind of thing that enchants people a little bit more. And I think all those factors together have really fed into the surge.
And do you think, because we've talked a bit about that during the campaign, that romantic vision of Ireland, and the first thing in the Sinn Féin manifesto is about Irish unity. Now, I don't think if you look at the things that people were voting on were health and housing.
Yes.
And housing has seemed to me, like we've talked about this on Friday, there are two housing politicians associated with housing that people in this country recognise. One is Owen Murphy.
Yeah, the two Owens,
there's nobody else. Like, who is Fianna Fáil? If you said to the public, here's Fianna Fáil, here's the Fianna Fáil housing spokesperson, who is this? They wouldn't recognise them.
Yeah.
So, Owen O'Brien has been the alternative to the housing issue. And health, I looked up their health. Everyone says everyone's party's health policies are the same. Now, Sinn Féin's is a bit more, they want an Irish NHS. That's what they're pushing. But that wasn't the thing that got purchased. It was the housing, and that is the thing that probably affects all demographics in different ways. If you're a parent, if you're a young person, and so that thing, rather than the romantic thing, it is a pragmatic vote for Sinn Féin.
I think it's both. I think that you can't separate the kind of Sinn Féin, you can't separate Sinn Féin from their rhetoric and their aesthetic almost. And then obviously you have, the dominant issue of particularly the past 5 years and certainly of the decade has been housing. And as you say, everybody is, unless you are very rich, everybody is experiencing or, knows somebody who's experiencing difficulty with regards to housing, whether that's can't buy a house, crazy rent, all that kind of stuff. We know that. Now, Fine Gael have consistently been saying it's getting better. We're building yay number of units and this and rebuilding Ireland and all this kind of stuff. And I think that there's an element of gaslighting there that the public kind of got sick of. Now, whether or not more housing units are kind of coming on stream, I mean, rebuilding Ireland as a document from the outset, the figures were kind of fantastical. The way that they were counting how many new homes were kind of coming online with, using these ESB connections that wasn't actually reflective of the real thing. And all the while people's rents are going up. And all the while people are having difficulty with building houses. So when you keep telling the electorate, no, we're handling it, it's fine, we've got it together, there'll be 20,000, then there'll be 30,000, there'll be 40,000. And when people aren't seeing that, at some point it just becomes, you know what, these guys over here are telling it like it is. They're saying that rents are crazy. They're saying there's going to be a rent freeze. They're saying that they're going to build 100,000 houses in the largest public housing project that the state has ever seen. When you have one party saying that, and the left-wing parties too, like PBP and, to a lesser extent Labour and people like that have been talking about housing in the type of tone that it needs to be spoken about. When you have people saying that really reflects the reality of what people are speaking. And then on the other hand, you have Leo, spinning off figures about how many houses they're going to be building. Maybe that is the case, but really people aren't seeing it.
But he also seemed to take this approach, which was he denied it was ideological, but it was you cannot do these things because landlords will leave the market, all these kind of things. But it all seemed to sort of gather around an ideological principle that we don't do too much to interfere with the market.
And a refusal to acknowledge that ideology. I mean, Owen Murphy has consistently said, when it is put to him about other ways forward with regards to the state building housing, says, oh, well, that would be an ideological approach, as if his and their approach isn't ideological. And that is a fundamental issue with Fine Gael, is that when you are privileged, you view your stance as the default.
As pragmatic.
And other things are different. And they could not recognise their own ideology. Or maybe we're just pretending they didn't have one, but not wanting to compete with landlords, not investigating how the state could get back into the development game, if not the actual building game, selling off state lands to developers in, real kind of sweetheart deals. it just became too much. Like, you only have to look through Daft, and you only have to look through the like ridiculous properties and rooms that people are putting up there and listen to people's experiences and the amount of rent that they're paying to say something's broken. And when something is broken and the government keeps telling you they're fixing it and you can't see the repairs happening, they're going to just give you the finger, basically.
Yeah, and as well as rewriting, renting regulations and landlord regulations so that they've basically been able to reintroduce bedsits known as co-living now. Co-living is obviously these hubs where, the rooms are, smaller than the size of a disabled parking space, are not a solution to the housing crisis. They cost €1,300 a month. They're again for very privileged tech workers who are going to be here for 8 months. So Owen Murphy can kind of claim that's not ideological, but how can it not be ideological when you're literally trying to reframe the idea of what a house is?
But isn't co-living a perfect example of whatever side you are on that, on how you fix the housing market, on their how they were tone deaf because they thought that co-living could exist outside the housing market as it affects most people, and it would be, as they said, this would be a solution for people who are here on short term, and it somehow wouldn't infect the rest of the housing market, rather than landlords looking at what co-living accommodation is charging for rent and saying, oh, we'll match our prices to that. If you've actually got a bedroom, if you've got a kitchen, we're going to hike up our rents because of the co-living. And in a functional housing market, maybe co-living would have been fine, but to introduce it on top of a dysfunctional one was a recipe for disaster politically, if not anything else.
And even if it wasn't going to have that much of an impact on the housing market, it's actually about sentiment again, and it's about what that stands for, and Owen Murphy was constantly trying to downplay co-living after introducing it, basically saying, it's not a 360 solution for the whole thing. And it's just going to be a small part of it. And it's like, people are looking around a city, particularly like Dublin, let's say, and you have, massive development everywhere and no housing being built. So, people are going to make the very obvious connection for themselves. Why do some folks get to build and others not? And it's just about squeezing out the greatest profit per square metre. That's why we're seeing, the proliferation of hotels and luxury student accommodation, and to a lesser extent co-living. And I think it's all of these different things began to be felt and be packaged as the things that Fine Gael stood for. And that Fine Gael stood for this kind of neoliberal, market-driven, global capital supported vision of a very hyper-capitalist Ireland. Now, that is not what most people in Ireland are into. Like, even, traditionally, particularly after the crash, I think that what people were kind of looking for when they were calling for public housing, when they were calling for a health service that functioned, was an equitable society in which people were taken care of. And even when you looked at the sentiment with regards to the exit polls on issues that people were voting on, tax was 4%.
Yeah.
Yet an incredible amount of people surveyed wanted public services, spending on public services increased without and no tax cuts. So like all of this kind of appeal to individualism just
extra
didn't
fiver
work.
in your pocket.
But also,
kind of.
but
people are too smart for that at this point.
But I remember we interviewed Pascal Donoghue last week, and I said that to him, that you're coming out, Leo's coming out when things like childcare are being raised in debates, when and his closing message in one of the debates, the lead item in his closing message was a tax cut. Now Pascal Donoghue makes the point that they were prioritizing public expenditure over tax cuts like every other party, but they're not leading, again, like co-living. They never wanted to make, for some reason, they still led with the message of tax cuts rather than, maybe because they felt it would be implausible for them to say that they were committed to improving public services when they've had,
because
9 years.
Tax cuts are easy, like as in to make, because all you have to do then is cut spending. And obviously Fine Gael will say that they've increased spending by the small margins that they have increased it by. But the fact is that you can easily cut taxes in a small way and give everybody an extra tenner and it's fine. But there's nothing more fundamental to existence than having somewhere to live. So and having somewhere to live that's not under threat of eviction at any given moment. So the fact is that people are at this point well beyond beyond considering, oh, well, I have an extra tenner to spend on, like spend it down the bookies or down the pub at the weekend, when they don't know if they're going to have anywhere to live or if there's anywhere nice to live, because it's not just about having somewhere to live, but having an actual quality of life. And I think the fact is that extra €10, that's not where your quality of life comes from. Quality of life comes from having really good public services, comes from having somewhere to live, etc., etc. And I don't think Fine Gael I think, like Una says, they really banked on the idea that people would be fooled by just kind of individualism and like a small increase in their own income. And that's but it just hasn't worked.
Una, was this not the mistake they made in 2016 as well?
I mean, I think that there was less anger in 2016.
Okay.
I think that how sentiment has shifted in those 4 years is significant, and in the middle of that, repeal came as well. I think more broadly, like when we look at generational shift, I'm kind of talking about 20, 25 year span of a generation. The type of people who were 30 when the crash hit and 10 years later are 40. They were locked out of housing then, they're locked out of it again now. We're not talking about the millennials like socialism. It's not about that. It's a broader sentiment. And I think that, there's just been a changing of how people feel and what their aspirations are. And I also think that, sure, it's not as quote unquote bad as it has been in the past, but I think our standards are higher. I think people want to kind of dream bigger and actually get some really good stuff happening in this country that is not about scaremongering around, if we do this, then all of the American companies are going to leave. We're constantly, Fine Gael is constantly talking about the outside forces that we're dependent on. Sinn Féin was very much talking about us, the us's, what is inside the country that can be harnessed. Now, whether that is populist, opportunistic, nationalistic, fantastical, we'll see. But they managed to tap into an Irish sentiment, was well, maybe we can, reach for bigger things. Whereas, I just don't think that Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil are really tuned into that vibe.
I think one of the most telling moments was in one of the leaders' debates when it was put to Leo Varadkar that corporations were paying 0% tax on their profits.
Well, this is the banks or the corporations.
That's it. Yeah. And Leo kind of jumped to and this is really misreading the room. Leo jumped to the defence of the banks and said, well, the banks have paid 1.4 billion in profit over the last 3 years. And it's just nobody wants to hear that, Leo. Nobody wants to hear your defence of the banks. People want to envisage an Ireland where people are reaping benefits. There's no use talking about how many banks are set up here or how many consultancy firms are set up here or how many tech firms are set up here if nobody is reaping any benefits from it. It's all well and good having, the Silicon Dock down there with Google and Apple and Facebook. But if Irish people can't benefit from that, then there is no usefulness to it. Which is again why Sinn Féin's message of we're the fifth country in the world, fifth richest country in the world by GDP per capita. I think some metrics actually have us higher, have us fourth. So it's frightening to think that you'd have this much homelessness and this kind of healthcare crises and childcare crises and all sorts of crises in a country where things should be really, really good. Things aren't really, really good. Things are middling at best and terrible for a lot of people. And the fact is that if Fine Gael keep on with the vision that the main people we need to appease are not the Irish people but tech companies, then obviously people are going to turn on them because people know they're not being protected. The money is there to protect people. The money is there to provide for people, but that's not what the money is being used for.
And does that go back to Una's point as well about people maybe dreaming bigger, so that the fear, this idea that be careful, what you wish doesn't really wash for people. So while there may be there may be some good reason for saying be careful about a populist message, be careful about all these things, it's for whatever reason people don't want to pay much attention to that.
Well, I think also there was a lot of patronising of the electorate during this campaign from Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and from the media as well, with regards to Trump and Brexit and they want to change as well, or the AFD or all this kind of stuff. And it's the vast majority of people voting for Sinn Féin or smaller kind of left-wing parties, they're not doing that out of, a sudden interest in right-wing populism. This, if anything, it's left-wing populism, and I think that really annoyed people as well, because people are politically literate. Like, they know what they're doing when they're going into the polling stations. They haven't suddenly lost their reason. And I think that, that revealed itself very much throughout the campaign, where after Fine Gael's campaign flopping within the first 3 days, when they realised their central messaging was actually terrible, they spent the next 2.5-3 weeks just attacking Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil. And so when you look at actually the aspects that Fine Gael accuse Sinn Féin of with regards to, some kind of, populist thing or campaigns that happen elsewhere, in actual fact, it was Fine Gael who were aping those type of campaigning mechanisms with their parody videos, with their stupid memes, with their attacking other parties. So, I think that they kind of fell apart. But, with regard, it's all about, it is probably one of the first kind of modern elections in Ireland where we're seeing kind of what happens elsewhere, in that feelings override facts to some degree. And the party that is most tapped into popular sentiment, gets ahead. And, we can talk about all the other generational shifts and what it means around, patriotism and having a female leader when there was so much feminist grassroots activism and all that kind of stuff. But, bread and butter issues, health and housing, Sinn Féin spoke to the masses on that, and people did not like this so-called, future to look forward to, because we were kind of living in Fine Gael's future and people didn't like it.
Well, we're seeing an example of that in Leo Varadkar's constituency with, as we're sitting here, the final tally is coming in, and Paul Donnelly has got 28% of the first preferences.
Sinn Féin's Paul Donnelly.
Paul
Crazy.
Donnelly, and Leo Varadkar won't get elected on the first count. So that is an example of this incredible
Apparently
shift.
he's the first TD not to get the first seat since 1977 or something. First Taoiseach not to get it in the first count since 1977 or something.
Okay.
And it also seems like he's going to be the first one not to pull in a running mate with him.
Right.
Which I mean is just a disaster.
Well, it's it is an extraordinary example of again Fine Gael's failure to read the room in this, and Leo Varadkar's, as you say, like the way they set out their campaign and how they've been backtracking and trying to recover ever since.
Absolutely. The most Trumpian moment of the entire campaign happened early on, when tragically that man by the banks of the canal was lifted up by an industrial vehicle and suffered life-changing injuries. And Leo Varadkar tried to pass the blame onto Dublin Lord Mayor Paul McAuliffe, which is exactly like what Donald Trump does when there's a forest fire in California or crime in Chicago or anything like that. He blames the local people who have far less control over, forest fire is a climate issue, it's Leo Varadkar and Fine Gael are absolutely the ones borrowing from the playbook of the populists when it comes to that kind of messaging.
Their whole, if you look at Brexit as an example, did they think that after looking at what Boris Johnson did, it would be such a fundamental misreading of the difference if they did, but did they think we can stress Brexit the way Boris Johnson has stressed Brexit, even though his thing was get Brexit done, and Brexit was done as far as Irish people are concerned?
I don't know what they were thinking, to be quite honest. I think if you walked out into any street in Ireland a month before the campaign and said asked 10 people what election issues were going to be important for them, you would have copped pretty quickly that Brexit wasn't going to be one of them. But I think that there was, this all feeds into the sense, and maybe it was compounded, that Fine Gael are very disconnected. But I also think that there's something about bureaucrat cosplay to them when they enter into campaigns, that this stuff makes us look governmenty and we're the responsible ones and we're in charge and we know what we're doing and we have the best team and all this kind of stuff. And it's quite, a lofty self-image, because to suggest that other parties or other politicians wouldn't also try and pursue a really good deal for Ireland is a bit much. And there's nothing amazingly special about the people who are kind of negotiating or managing Brexit on Ireland's behalf. So I think that they basically, again, they were looking at where they shine in their eyes versus what people actually want. And of course, the economy turning around and there being more employment and Brexit being managed to some degree makes Fine Gael look really, really good on an international stage. But at home, people were still trying to find gaffes, and that's what it comes down to.
It was also a squabbling. It also shows that they were thinking that it was going to be a squabble between them and Fianna Fáil, because they're like, if Brexit, if people are going to, we want to stress our differences with Fianna Fáil on the issue of Brexit and how we have got the team, whereas other people weren't looking at either of those parties for the solution to their problems.
Right, and I think it's really important as well. Like, we won't know how the seats pan out for a little while, but like, there was also this narrative that Fianna Fáil were going to do really well.
Yeah.
That they were going to
I'd say they're more disappointed than Fine Gael are today, I would say.
Yeah. So like that's also really important as well. It's not just a rejection of Fine Gael, it's also a rejection of both of them together. And Mary Lou McDonald was obviously very successful in like packaging them as, you know, two specials sellotape together.
Yes.
But you know, but I think that it's important to it's not just like, you know, loads of people hate Fine Gael, but it is that packaging of the old politics and people saying, actually, we want to try something new. And it isn't, you know, unbelievably radical to vote in a different way. I mean, when you look at the social change that has been activated in Ireland over the past decade, extraordinarily difficult thing to do, building movements, changing constitutions, like voting for a different party is hardly a mammoth task when you see what change can do in that way. And I think that is kind of subconsciously feeding into how people are behaving.
And I do think the Irish public has always been well to the left of the Irish government.
Yes.
As in, you'll see that going back as far as 1990, electing someone like Mary Robinson, like a champion of women's rights in 1990, like so long ago, before, you know, some countries even had, like, I think Switzerland only introduced like the right to vote for women, like really late on in their existence. So like, you know, you have her and people like Michael D. Higgins, you know, getting in emphatically twice. That shows that when we vote as a country, and referendums show this as well, you know, the marriage equality and repeal, when we vote nationally and it's all just one large constituency, we are well to the left of what we end up with in Dáil Éireann, because we really have two centre-right parties that have represented us since 1920, and that is so due to local issues and local politics, and it's not representative of how people feel ideologically when it comes to things like, should we all have houses? I think across the board in Ireland, you will find almost everybody believes we should all have a right to housing. I think there is evidence that people think we should have a right to housing. I think if you talk about, should anyone ever be on a trolley in a hospital, I think we all agree that nobody should ever be on a trolley in a hospital. And that's the kind of thing that, so now that the country, I think, is starting to look at things more nationally than more locally, we're ending up with more left-wing results.
I think that's totally true. Like, it's a rare occasion that we are voting with that national vista in mind, because obviously we know that parliamentary politics is dogged by parochialism. So yeah, that's a really good point.
And what do you think finally, for the 31% who voted for radical change, what do you think, how satisfied do you think they're going to be by whatever the outcome is when everything, you know, when the seats are all tallied up?
It really depends. I mean, there's way too long to go. You know, like, the fact is, once the seats are tallied up, then you're into coalition talks. And people who voted for radical change, for example, will not be happy if it seems like Sinn Féin are going to go down the same avenue Labour did in 2011 and kind of join up with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. I think Sinn Féin, we're on the cusp of a seismic change. We're not quite into the seismic change yet. Sinn Féin will be looking at constituencies like Angus O'Snodig's and Mary Lou McDonald's, and they'll be wishing they ran two candidates there. So Sinn Féin could have done a lot better in this election had they simply run more candidates. And if they're thinking of now playing the legs to Fine Gael's table or Fianna Fáil's table, I think the people who voted for radical change will obviously be very disappointed, because nothing could be less radical than that.
Yeah, I think Sinn Féin have Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil in quite the bind now, because, you know, obviously never say never, but I do think it will be difficult for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil to roll back on their kind of assurances that they wouldn't go into coalition with Sinn Féin. And on the other hand, when they go, I'm probably saying when, but if they go in together, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, you're going to have this incredibly unpopular centre-right government in power, and that Sinn Féin will make hay a period in opposition for that. So they're Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil right now are kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. I feel that this is election one of two. I don't know how soon that election will come, but, you know, Sinn Féin will obviously look at all of the numbers. They'll look at the likes of Mary Lou getting nearly 2 quotas You know, having a surplus for the first time in that constituency in Dublin Central. Like you said, Angus, Desi Ellis, all these people pulling in huge numbers. Owen O'Brien pulling in his running mate and so on. So I think that whatever happens, Sinn Féin are just much better position now in another election, because they can just run a rake of candidates, do really good vote management, use their very strong ground game, surf their own wave, and who knows where we'll be this time next year.
Brilliant, guys. Thanks a lot.